Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to focus on filtering pivot tables, and specifically, we're going to look at the use of slicers, which actually presents some particularly straightforward ways of filtering in pivot tables. Before we do that, I have a few things to point out that I haven't pointed out so far. One of which is that if I want to refresh a pivot table, you've already seen the refresh button on the Analyze ribbon. And to the right of that, there is a Change Data Source option. And if I click on that, it takes me to the source of the pivot table and allows me to make changes there, so that can be very useful. And the other thing about a pivot table is that over on the left here, you have the Options drop down. And there are some very useful options within pivot table options. In particular, I'd like to look at the Data tab. And one of the options on the Data tab is Refresh Data when opening a file. It can be quite useful to have that set, particularly if your pivot table depends on data which is being refreshed from outside of itself. It's well worth going through the tabs in the pivot table options and setting your options as you would like them. And also on the Analyze tab over on the right, you have a Show Group. And one of the options there lets you switch on and off the field list. There is also an option here that switches on or off the plus or minus buttons. So that allows you to collapse and expand the items in the pivot table. And there's another one that displays the field headers for rows and columns. Something else I haven't used so far that's actually very useful is the right-click menu. When you right-click, you have a whole host of options within that menu, so don't forget that they're there. So for example, I have B6 currently selected. I've got the month of February selected. And when I right-click on that, it directly gives me access to Group and Ungroup. So ungrouping the month there takes the data right back to the original dates from the source data. And if I right-click again and go to Group, and group the dates by month, it takes me back to how we were. And as far as the data itself is concerned, we've already seen the effect of being able to hover over each cell and being able to see, in this case, the sum of the values. One of the other options you have here is to right-click and go to Show Details. And it takes you through to all of the source rows in the source table that relate to that specific combination of field values. And you notice there that Excel creates another sheet with the data on it. Now, another way to access that information is just to double click. So essentially, you're drilling down into that particular data. And another thing to point out is if I go to the Pivot Table Design tab, I can choose my pivot table style from the drop down. So if I wanted something a little bit more intense color-wise, I could hover over and make any of these selections. So let's go with this one. Styles work pretty much the same way they do in tables in Excel, but you just have a few less options, but basically it works the same. Let's turn our attention now towards filters. I've swapped or pivoted the department and the branch field. In each row in the pivot table, I have potentially two filters. I have a date filter and I have a branch filter. So for instance, if I click on the branch drop down here, I'll get the appropriate filters. For instance, I could decide to just show the Houston and Atlanta figures just by selecting Houston and Atlanta. Note the effects on the totals of each of those departments, of course. And of course, I can easily clear a filter at any time, just by clicking Clear Filter from Branch. Similarly, with dates, not only can I choose which months I show, but I can click on Date Filters. And I have the normal date filter options, things like next week, last month, last year, and so on. If I deselect all of the months and just select January and February, and click on OK, watch what happens. Of course, I only see data for two departments, and of course the reason there is only data for two departments is that we only recorded sales in those two departments in January and February. Now this returns to a point I mentioned earlier on. Sometimes when you apply filters, it can be deceptive. So somebody looking at this table might not know that you've filtered on January and February. They may think that you have filtered on breads or coffee. So you need to be careful that you don't make assumptions on the filters that have been applied purely on the basis of what you can see in the column headers and row headers. Now, of course, the filter symbols are a clue, but you need to be careful people don't jump to the wrong conclusion. Now, another very useful feature when you're filtering is this, and what I'm going to do is remove the date filter just by clicking Clear Filter from Date, and I'm going to right-click on February and going to Group, and I'm going to group by months and quarters, and click OK. And I'm going to move the quarters field up into the filters drop zone. So we're going to drag and drop. Now what you can see is that I have my pivot table with quarters as a separate entity up here on the left. So if I just wanted to show quarter 2, I can select it from the filter and click OK. Note that with this type of filter, I have the option of selecting multiple items here. So I could select multiple quarters if I wanted to. And one other thing before we move on to slicers, if you have a field that has many different values, you may find it hard to find the particular value you want to filter on. So in the case of department, I have about 15 departments, but say I had 100, 200, 300, there is a search facility here as well. So if I wanted to look for tea, I could type in tea and it will return back to me all of the results that contain that particular word. So you see here I have hot teas and tea. So let's move on to slicers. Slicers are a very useful way of filtering. They are very good in presentations, and they're also very good if you want to keep track of exactly what has been filtered. Now, one of the problems of slicers is that they do take up quite a lot of space on the screen. So what I tend to do is leave some space around the sides of a pivot table and also sometimes across the top, depending on what I'm doing, which will give me room to add those slicers in. So I'm going to click somewhere inside the pivot table. And now one of the options that I have in the filter group is Insert Slicer. Now that brings up the Insert Slicers dialog, and I can decide which slicers I want. So I'm going to have slicers for branch and department, and click OK. Now these slicers basically work like filters, and sometimes you get in situations like I have here where there sort of isn't really enough room for them without obscuring part of the pivot table. But the sort of thing you can do, for instance, here is use the sizing handles. So let's move these over. This is why I like to leave a little bit of room. And as you can see, it's kind of obscuring part of my pivot table, but I can just drag that resize handle in and also drag that one up a little bit. And we'll pop the other one in underneath and do the same thing. We'll just resize that in. So you can sort of adjust them so that they fit nicely next to your pivot table. Now you'll also note that if I click on one of the slicers, I get the Slicer Tools contextual ribbon tab at the top, and underneath there I have a whole host of options which I can use to control my slicer, so formatting options. But what I also have is I can adjust how many columns I'm viewing. So currently I have it set to 1, but if I put it up to 2, if you look at the slicer now, you can see I have 2 columns, and I could carry on if I wanted to. Gets a little bit crazy, so let's just break it down like so. And that gives me a little bit more room because I can then resize and I can move the next one up. And I could do the same thing just to keep things consistent. In fact, let's just do 2 for that one and drag it up slightly. So you do have formatting options for your slicers as well. So now let's do some slicing. Let's suppose I want to slice to show the figures for Atlanta. So if I click on Atlanta, my results are filtered just for Atlanta. If I want to apply the coffee filter, then in the department slicer, I can click on coffee, and I only see coffee for Atlanta. Of course, it's quite often the case that you might want to see multiple items, which you can again do very easily. So if I wanted to see coffee and hot tea, I just need to hold down the Control key and make my second selection, and the pivot table will update. So it's now showing coffee and hot tea for Atlanta. And if I want to do the same thing in my branch filter, I could click on Detroit whilst holding down Control, and there we go. So that's the basic use of slicers. Note that with a slicer selected, on the Slicer Tools Options tab, you have the Slicers Styles gallery. So if you're trying to match something in a presentation, you have a number of slicer styles there to choose from. To remove a slicer, all you need to do is select it and hit the Delete key. Note that in this case, although the slicer is removed, the filters that were specified on it are still in force, but of course I could click on the department filter here and say select all and click on OK to bring back all of that information. And one other point, with the pivot table tools selected, to the right of Insert Slicer, there is an Insert Timeline, and Insert Timeline is a special type of slicer and it's related to date. So if I select date and click on OK, I get a date slicer. Let me click on August, and you'll see that I've now sliced for the month of August, and there is nothing to show for that particular month. And I can drag my timeline slicer out, and let's try and drag it out so that we get some data in here. Let's drag it back. And there we go. So depending on where your data is, you might have to adjust this slightly, but this is specifically for filtering or slicing on dates. So I can use what is in effect a visual date slicer to filter on a date. And again, you might have to leave a little bit of room for this type of slicer. So I'm going to drag mine down a little bit and just reposition this across the top like so, and drag it all the way across so it's easy to see. And with all the slicers, you have a clear filter option as well. So that's it on slicers. Please join me in the next section.